one stolen tank, one concrete wall, one desperate man. The night freedom crashed through communism. April 16, 1963, East Berlin, the city of broken dreams and shattered families. Wolfgang Engels stood in the dim light of the military garage, his hands black with engine grease, his soul heavy with something far darker, the crushing weight of a life stolen from him. At 20 years old, he should have been dreaming about the future, about love, about the infinite possibilities that youth promises. Instead, he dreamed only of escape. The Soviet BTR-152 armored personnel carrier sat before him like a sleeping beast. 6 wheels, 8 tons of steel, a diesel engine that could generate 110 horsepower. Wolfgang knew every bolt, every wire, every weak point of this machine. For 3 years, he'd worked as a civilian mechanic for the East German National People's Army, maintaining their fleet of Soviet-made vehicles. He'd learned their secrets. He'd earned their trust, and tonight, he would betray that trust in the most spectacular way possible. But to understand why, Wolfgang Engels was willing to risk everything, willing to die. If necessary, you have to understand how he ended up trapped behind the most infamous barrier in human history, the Berlin Wall. Wolfgang was born in 1943 in Düsseldorf, in what would become West Germany. His early childhood was chaos, the final years of World War II, where every day brought new horrors, new destructions, new reasons to believe the world was ending. His father died in the war, one of millions consumed by Hitler's madness. His mother, Lena, was a devoted communist who believed with religious fervor that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope when Germany was divided. In 1949, Lena made a decision that would haunt her son forever. She moved them to East Germany, to the German Democratic Republic, the socialist paradise promised by the Communist Party. "You'll see, Wolfgang," she told her 6-year-old son as they crossed into the Soviet sector. "Here, everyone is equal. Here, everyone has enough. Here, we build the future." Young Wolfgang believed her. Children believe their parents, especially when they have no other choice. He grew up in East Berlin, attended communist schools, joined the Young Pioneers, sang songs praising Stalin and the glorious revolution. But as he grew older, as his eyes opened, as his mind began to question, Wolfgang started to see the cracks in the paradise his mother had promised. The future being built in East Germany looked suspiciously like a prison by his teenage years. Wolfgang could no longer ignore the truth. While his mother remained a true believer, he saw the empty shops, the secret police watching everyone, the friends who disappeared in the night for saying the wrong thing, the families separated by an increasingly militarized border. He saw the propaganda for what it was, lies painted over a rotting foundation. And then, on August 13, 1961, came the final proof that the German Democratic Republic was not a paradise but a cage. Wolfgang was 18 when the Berlin Wall began to rise. He watched, in horror, as literally overnight, the communist government erected barbed wire barriers across Berlin, cutting the city in half. Streets were torn up, buildings were evacuated and sealed. Families were separated, some waking up to find their loved ones on the wrong side of a barrier that appeared like a nightmare made concrete. The official explanation was that the wall protected East Germans from Western fascism. The truth was simpler and more brutal. The wall existed because without it, everyone would leave. By 1961, nearly 3 million East Germans had already fled to the West. The communist government was bleeding out its population, losing its doctors, engineers, teachers, anyone with skills and ambition. The wall wasn't built to keep people out. It was built to keep people in. And Wolfgang, along with 16 million others, was now a prisoner in his own country, The irony cut deep when Wolfgang was assigned to help construct portions of the wall. As a young mechanic with technical skills, he operated machinery that helped build the barrier that would imprison him. Every block of concrete he watched being set in place was another bar on his cage. Every meter of barbed wire was another thread in his shroud. "Mama," he said to his mother one evening, "can't you see what this is? They've built a wall to keep us trapped. If this place is so great, why do they need a wall to stop us from leaving?" Lena Engels looked at her son with disappointment and anger. "You've been poisoned by Western propaganda. The wall protects us. You should be grateful." That night, Wolfgang made a decision. He would get out. Somehow, someway, he would escape this prison disguised as a country. But escaping East Germany in 1963 was not like sneaking across an unguarded border. The Berlin Wall was the most sophisticated prison barrier ever constructed. It wasn't just one wall, it was two parallel walls with a death strip between them, filled with guard towers, searchlights, attack dogs, landmines, and soldiers with shoot-to-kill orders. People who tried to climb it were shot. People who tried to dig under it were caught. People who tried to swim across rivers were drowned or captured. By 1963, the wall had already claimed dozens of lives. Peter Fechter, 18 years old, had been shot trying to climb the wall and left to bleed to death in the death strip while the world watched in horror. His screams haunted Wolfgang's nightmares. How do you escape the inescapable? Wolfgang worked his mechanic job, kept his head down, and thought. He studied the wall, learned its routines, watched the guard patrols. He noticed something interesting. Military vehicles could pass through checkpoints without extensive searches. The guards trusted the army. They trusted the system. What if someone used that trust against them? The idea was insane, suicidal, impossible. What if someone stole a military vehicle and simply crashed through the wall? The more Wolfgang thought about it, the more he realized it might actually work. The wall was designed to stop people on foot, people with shovels, people with ropes. It wasn't designed to stop 8 tons of Soviet armor moving at full speed, but the vehicle would have to be fast, enough to break through before guards could react, strong enough to smash through concrete and barbed wire. And Wolfgang would have to know how to drive it, which meant it would have to be a vehicle from his own motor pool. The BTR-152. It was perfect. Well, as perfect as a suicide mission could be. For months, Wolfgang planned. He studied the patrol schedules, memorized the guard rotations, identified the weakest point in the wall. He chose his moment, the evening before May Day, April 30th, 1963. The military would be preparing for the big May Day parade, moving vehicles around, chaos and confusion everywhere. In that chaos, one missing APC might not be noticed immediately. The route was clear in his mind. Bernauer Strasse, a street literally cut in half by the wall. Buildings on the south side had been evacuated and sealed. The north side was West Berlin Freedom, just 60 meters away. 60 meters. The length of an Olympic swimming pool. The distance between prison and paradise. On April 30th, Wolfgang reported for work at the motor pool as usual. His hands shook slightly as he checked his assigned vehicles. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest before he could escape the country. Around him, soldiers and mechanics moved vehicles, preparing for the next day's parade. Everything was controlled chaos. At 3 p.m., most of the workers went to lunch. The motor pool was nearly empty. Wolfgang walked to the BTR-152 he'd been working on. The keys were in the ignition standard practice during maintenance. His hand touched the door handle. This was it, the moment of no return. If he got in that vehicle and started the engine, He would become a traitor to the state, an enemy of the people, a criminal deserving of death. His mother would disown him. His friends would condemn him. History, at least the history written by the communists, would remember him as a villain. But what is treason against a prison? What is betrayal of a system that betrays its own people? What is crime against a government that makes freedom illegal? Wolfgang opened the door and climbed in. The engine started with a deep, powerful rumble. The guards at the motor pool entrance barely glanced at him as he drove out. Just another military vehicle moving for parade preparations. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Wolfgang pointed the BTR 152 toward Bernauer Strasse and pressed the accelerator. The streets of East Berlin passed in a blur. Wolfgang's mind was crystal clear, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Every turn was calculated. Every street memorized. He'd driven this route in his dreams 1,000 times. Pedestrians stopped and stared as the armored vehicle rumbled past. This was unusual. Military vehicles didn't normally drive through residential streets. But no one challenged him. The armor and the red star on the vehicle's side were permission enough. In a totalitarian state, you don't question the military. Wolfgang's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. His foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. The BTR 152 wasn't fast, maybe 60 kilometers per hour on a good road, but it was fast enough. It had to be fast enough. As he approached Bernauer Strasse, Wolfgang saw it, the wall. From this close, it was more terrifying than he'd ever imagined. 3.5 meters of concrete, topped with barbed wire, backed by a second wall, with guard towers every 100 meters. Searchlights, machine guns, death incarnate, stretched across a city. And then Wolfgang did something extraordinary, something that would be debated and discussed and analyzed for decades afterward. Something that transformed this escape from a desperate act of self-preservation into something larger. Something that spoke to the human capacity for hope, even in the darkest moments. He stopped in the middle of the street, 100 meters from the wall. Wolfgang Engels stopped the BTR-152 and opened his door. People on the street froze, terrified. Soldiers didn't stop and talk to civilians in East Germany. Nothing good ever came from military attention. Wolfgang stood in the doorway of the armored vehicle and shouted, "I'm going to the west. Who's coming with me?" Silence. Complete, stunned silence. An old woman with a shopping bag stared at him like he'd lost his mind. A man in a factory uniform took a step backward. A young couple looked at each other, hope and terror warring on their faces. "I'm breaking through the wall," Wolfgang shouted again, his voice cracking with emotion. "There's room for people. If you want freedom, get in now." The young couple took a step forward. Then they stopped. The hope in their eyes died, replaced by fear. They shook their heads and hurried away. The old woman crossed herself and rushed into a building. The factory worker turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction. Nobody moved. Nobody accepted the offer. Wolfgang stood there for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. 30 seconds of silence. 30 seconds where he offered liberation to his fellow prisoners and received only fear in response. That's what the wall did. That's what totalitarianism does. It doesn't just trap bodies. It traps minds. It makes people so afraid, so broken, so convinced that resistance is futile, that even when freedom is literally offered, on a plate, by a man with a vehicle that could break them out, they can't accept it. They can't believe it's real. They can't overcome the fear. Wolfgang understood. He didn't blame them. In their place, he might have been too afraid as well. After all, what he was doing looked like suicide. It probably was suicide, but he was doing it anyway. He climbed back into the BTR-152, closed the door, and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The vehicle surged forward. 60 meters to freedom. 50, 40. That's when the guards saw him. A whistle blew. Then another. Shouts in German. Halt. Stop. Stop the vehicle. Wolfgang didn't stop. He aimed the BTR-152 directly at the wall. The speedometer climbed. 40 kilometers per hour. 50, 60. The guard towers erupted in gunfire. Bullets pinged off the armored hull. Wolfgang heard them striking all around him. A deadly rain of metal. The windshield was thick glass, designed to stop small arms fire, but even as Wolfgang watched, cracks began to spiderweb across it from the impacts. 20 meters. 10. Please, Wolfgang whispered to the machine around him. To God, to fate, to whatever force might be listening. Please let this work. The BTR-152 hit the Berlin Wall at 63 kilometers per hour. The impact was apocalyptic. 8 tons of moving steel met 3.5 meters of concrete. The sound was like thunder, like the world ending, like every terrible thing happening at once. Wolfgang was thrown forward against his seatbelt hard enough to crack ribs. The windshield exploded inward in a shower of safety glass. The entire vehicle shuddered, metal screaming, engine howling. For one terrible moment, Wolfgang thought he'd failed, thought the wall had won, thought this was it, his death, crushed against the barrier that represented everything he hated. Then he felt it. The vehicle was still moving. The wall hadn't stopped him. It had slowed him, damaged him, but it hadn't stopped him. The BTR-152 ground forward through the rubble, its engine roaring defiance, its wheels churning over broken concrete. Wolfgang could see daylight, actual daylight, through the dust and debris ahead, but the vehicle was dying. The impact had destroyed the front axle. The engine was making terrible grinding sounds. Steam and smoke poured from the hood. The BTR-152 lurched, shuddered, and began to slow. Wolfgang looked ahead desperately. He'd broken through the first wall, but he was stuck in the death strip, the killing zone between the two barriers. The second wall loomed ahead, and his vehicle was finished. It rolled forward on momentum alone, slower and slower, finally coming to rest halfway through the death strip, about 30 meters from freedom. So close, so impossibly close. The guards were recovering from their shock. Wolfgang heard boots running, more gunfire, orders being shouted. He had seconds, maybe less. He kicked open the damaged door and ran. His legs moved on instinct, powered by pure adrenaline and desperation. 29 meters, 28. Behind him, he heard the distinctive crack of rifle shots. 25 meters. Something punched him in the back hard. No pain yet, just impact. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Kept running. 20 meters. Another impact, lower in his leg. This time there was pain, bright, sharp, terrible. His leg buckled. He fell, 15 meters from freedom. Wolfgang Engels lay in the dirt of the death strip, shot twice, unable to stand, and freedom was 15 meters away. He could see West Berlin clearly now. Could see the different buildings, the different lights. Could see people, actual people, West Berliners watching from windows and rooftops. Could see West German police taking cover, unable to help him because crossing into the death strip would start a firefight between East and West. So close. He'd come so far, risked so much, and he was going to die 15 meters short of freedom. Wolfgang began to crawl. The East. German guards were climbing over the rubble now, weapons raised, shouting at him to stop, to surrender. Wolfgang ignored them. He crawled forward through the dirt, through his own blood, pulling himself toward the second wall with his hands, his injured leg dragging behind him. 10 meters. 9. The guards were almost on him. He could hear their boots, their angry voices. One of them fired another shot. The bullet kicked up dirt inches from Wolfgang's head. 8 meters. 7. And then the West Berliners acted. They couldn't cross into the death strip. That would violate the border and could start an international incident. But there was a bar on the western side, right next to the wall, the Bernauer Strasse pub. Its customers had been watching the entire escape attempt through their windows. They'd seen Wolfgang offer freedom to strangers who were too afraid to. Except they'd seen him crash through the wall in a stolen armored vehicle. They'd seen him shot down while trying to crawl to freedom. And they decided that even if governments had rules about who could cross borders, human beings had obligations that transcended politics. A dozen customers poured out of the bar and ran to the wall. They formed a human pyramid, climbing on each other's shoulders, reaching over the barbed wire and concrete at the top. Their hands stretched down into the death strip toward Wolfgang. "Grab on," they screamed at him. "Give us your hands." Wolfgang looked up through a haze of pain and saw salvation reaching down. He stretched his arms up. West German hands grabbed his wrists, his arms, his jacket. They pulled. The East German guards grabbed his legs, trying to drag him back. For one surreal moment, Wolfgang Engels was literally being pulled in two directions, east and west: communism and freedom, prison and paradise. The West Berliners pulled harder. Wolfgang's torn jacket gave way. His body slid upward. The guards lost their grip. And then he was over the wall, falling into the arms of strangers who'd risked their own safety to save a man they'd never met. They carried him into the bar and laid him on a table. Someone was calling for an ambulance. Someone else was pressing towels against his wounds to stop the bleeding. Wolfgang looked around at the concerned faces surrounding him, at the lights that seemed brighter here, at the very air that somehow seemed freer. "Where am I?" he whispered, though he knew the answer. "West Berlin," someone told him, smiling through tears. "You made it. You're free." Wolfgang Engels smiled. Then he passed out. Wolfgang woke up 3 days later in a West Berlin hospital. The doctors told him he'd been shot twice, once in the lower back, once in the thigh. He'd lost a dangerous amount of blood. His left lung had collapsed. For a while, they'd thought he might not survive, but survive he did. Youth and determination can overcome remarkable odds. As he recovered, reporters came. Newspapers around the world ran his story. German mechanic steals tank, crashes through Berlin Wall. The escape became international news, a symbol of the human desire for freedom, a dramatic middle finger to the communist system that claimed to represent the will of the people. The East German government was humiliated. One man with a stolen APC had breached the wall, making their supposedly impenetrable barrier look foolish. They issued statements calling Wolfgang a criminal, a traitor, a Western agent. His mother, Lena, was interrogated for days. She told the Stasi, the secret police, that she disowned her son, that he was dead to her, that she'd raised a traitor and was ashamed. Wolfgang learned about his mother's rejection while still in the hospital. It hurt worse than the bullets. "I don't understand," he told a nurse, tears running down his face. "I'm her son. How can she choose an ideology over her own child?" The nurse, an older woman who'd lived through her own share of horror, held his hand. "Some people," she said gently, "love ideas more than they love people. It's one of the great tragedies of the human condition." As Wolfgang healed, he learned more about what his escape had triggered. The East German government, paranoid and furious, conducted a massive investigation. How had Engels stolen a vehicle from a military motor pool? Had there been accomplices? Was there a conspiracy? They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Wolfgang had acted alone, exploiting a moment of opportunity and a gap in their security. But the Stasi doesn't accept simple explanations. They prefer conspiracies. For years afterward, they would watch Wolfgang's former friends and colleagues, destroying careers and lives in search of phantom accomplices. Wolfgang also learned that his escape attempt had inspired others. In the weeks after his crash through the wall, 3 other people tried similar escapes using vehicles. One succeeded, a young man who drove a bus through a checkpoint. 2 failed and were killed. Wolfgang carried the weight of those deaths with him. Had his example given them hope, or had it given them false confidence that led to their murders? "You can't think like that," a West German policeman told him. "Those people made their own choices. You showed them what was possible. What they did with that knowledge was up to them." But Wolfgang did think like that. He would always think like that. After 3 weeks, Wolfgang was discharged from the hospital. The West German government gave him citizenship, a small apartment, and help finding work. He was free. He was safe. He was in the West. But freedom, he discovered, was more complicated than he'd imagined. In East Germany, for all its horrors, life had a certain simplicity. The rules were clear. Obey, conform, don't question. Everything was decided for you, where you worked, what you earned, what you could say. It was a prison, but prisons have structure. In West Berlin, Wolfgang had choices. Infinite choices. What career? What life? What future? After 20 years of having every decision made by the state, the freedom to choose was overwhelming. He struggled, got depressed, drank too much, started fights. The trauma of the escape, the betrayal by his mother, the survivor's guilt about others who'd failed, it all crashed down on him. It took years, therapy, and the support of good people to help Wolfgang build a new life. He became a teacher, working with troubled youth. He volunteered with the fire brigade. He married, had children, found purpose in helping others. But he never forgot where he came from. Never forgot the wall. Never forgot the price of freedom. In the 1980s, Wolfgang learned that the East German government had planned to kidnap him. The Stasi had developed an operation to lure him close to the border, grab him, and drag him back to East Germany to face trial. The plot was only abandoned when they decided it was too risky, that it might fail and cause an international incident. "They never forgave you," a West German intelligence officer told him. To them, you weren't just a man who escaped. You were proof that their system could be beaten. You were a living symbol that freedom was worth any risk. They hated you for that. Wolfgang smiled grimly. Good. I hope I haunted their dreams. The years passed. The Cold War continued. The wall stood, a scar across Berlin and across history. Wolfgang grew older. His children grew up. Life went on. And then, impossibly, on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Wolfgang stood in the crowd that night, tears streaming down his face as people poured through the open checkpoints, as families reunited after decades of separation, as the barrier that had defined his life came crashing down. He thought about his escape 26 years earlier, thought about all the people who hadn't made it, thought about the price of freedom and the cost of its absence. Someone recognized him, the man who'd crashed through the wall in a stolen APC. People wanted to shake his hand, hear his story, celebrate him as a prophet who'd known the wall would fall. But Wolfgang deflected the praise. "I wasn't fighting the wall," he said. "I was just trying to get home." The wall fell because millions of people over decades refused to accept it. Because every person who escaped, every person who resisted, every person who kept hope alive, they all pushed against that concrete until it cracked. I was just one push among millions. In 1990, with Germany reunified, Wolfgang could finally go back to the places of his youth. He walked through East Berlin, so familiar, yet so changed. He visited his old neighborhood, and, with a heart full of hope and fear, he went to see his mother. Lena Engels was 71 years old, living in a small apartment, her communist paradise having collapsed around her. When she opened the door and saw her son, the son she'd disowned 47 years earlier, her face showed shock. Then anger, then something that might have been shame. "Mama," Wolfgang said simply. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Lena began to cry deep, racking sobs that seemed to tear from the deepest part of her soul. "I was wrong," she whispered. "About everything. The party, the system, the wall. I believed lies my entire life. And I lost my son because I loved an idea more than I loved you." Wolfgang stepped forward and embraced his mother. "I forgive you," he said. "We were all prisoners, Mama. You just didn't know you were in a cage." They spent the next 4 years rebuilding their relationship before. Lena passed away in 1994. Wolfgang was with her when she died, holding her hand, telling her stories about his children, her grandchildren, that she'd never met that Wolfgang. Engels lived to see the 21st century. He watched as the former East Germany transformed, as the scars of division slowly healed, as a new generation grew up who'd never known the wall except as history. He gave talks at schools, telling young people about the escape, showing them photos of the wall, of the death strip, of the BTR 152 that had carried him through. Most of the students could barely comprehend a wall through a city, a government that shot people for trying to leave. It sounded like dystopian fiction, not history from their parents' lifetime. "Remember this," Wolfgang would tell them. "Freedom isn't natural. It's not the default state of human affairs. For most of history, most people have lived under systems that controlled them, exploited them, imprisoned them. Freedom has to be fought for, protected, cherished. And sometimes it has to be stolen from those who would deny it." Historians and documentarians came to interview him. The BTR 152, recovered from the death strip and kept by a museum, became a symbol of Cold War resistance. Wolfgang's story was told in books, films, exhibitions, but Wolfgang himself remained humble. "I'm not a hero," he would insist. "I was just a mechanic who'd had enough." The real heroes were the ones who helped build the resistance, who helped others escape, who stood up to totalitarianism, even when it meant death. "I just wanted to go home." When asked about the moment he stopped and offered to take people with him, Wolfgang always paused before answering. "I think," he would say slowly, "that moment showed me something important about human nature. Fear is a prison more powerful than any wall. The people I offered freedom to, they were too afraid to accept it. And I understand that. The system had broken them. But it also showed me that one person, acting with courage, can offer hope, even if that hope isn't immediately accepted. Maybe someone who saw me that day thought differently afterward. Maybe I planted a seed. We never know how our actions ripple forward through time." In his later years, Wolfgang became concerned about new walls being built, not just physical barriers, but ideological ones. Walls of propaganda and misinformation, walls of tribalism and hate. He spoke out about the importance of free speech, free press, the exchange of ideas. "The wall fell because truth couldn't be contained forever," he said. "Because information found ways through. Because people on both sides realized we are all just humans, wanting the same basic things: safety, dignity, a chance for our children to have better lives. When you build walls, physical or mental, you're saying that we can't talk to each other, can't understand each other, can't find common ground. That's how you get tragedies." Wolfgang Engels died in 2021 at the age of 78. His funeral was attended by hundreds former East Germans he'd inspired, West Germans who'd helped him that night. historians who documented his story, students he taught, and his children and grandchildren who'd heard his story 1,000 times but never tired of it. At the service, one of his daughters read a letter Wolfgang had written years earlier but requested be read only after his death. I lived in a prison and escaped. That makes me neither special nor heroic. It makes me human. Every person wants freedom. I just had the fortune, or misfortune, to be in a position where I could seize it. But remember, I didn't destroy the wall. I just crashed through one small section of it. The wall fell because millions of people over decades refused to accept it. Every person who escaped, every person who protested, every person who kept hope alive, they all contributed to its fall. I was one small part of a much larger story. Freedom isn't free. It costs blood and sacrifice, and sometimes everything you have. It cost me my relationship with my mother for decades. It cost others their lives. But it's worth the cost. Always. If you take one lesson from my story, let it be this: never accept a cage, no matter how nicely decorated. Never accept a wall, no matter how necessary they claim it is. Never accept a system that treats you as property rather than a person. And if you find yourself in such a system, remember, walls can be broken. Prisons can be escaped. Freedom, once tasted, can never be forgotten. Somewhere tonight, someone is dreaming of freedom. Somewhere tonight, someone is planning their escape. Somewhere tonight, someone is looking at their wall and refusing to accept it. To those people, I say, yes, it's possible. Yes, it's worth it. Yes, you can break through. I did it with a stolen tank. What will you use? Epilogue: the truth behind the Hijacked lines, the story of Wolfgang Engels, has been told and retold, often with embellishments. Here are the verified facts. Wolfgang Engels was born in 1943 in Dusseldorf and moved to East Germany with his communist mother as a child. On April 30th, 1963, at age 20, he stole a Soviet BTR-152 armored personnel carrier from the East German military motor pool where he worked as a mechanic. He did stop and offer civilians a ride to freedom. None accepted. Witnesses confirmed this detail. He crashed through the Berlin Wall at Bernauer Strasse at approximately 3:30 p.m. The vehicle became stuck halfway through the death strip. He was shot twice while attempting to climb over the second wall. West Berlin citizens from a nearby bar did form a human chain and pulled him to safety, while East German guards tried to drag him back. He spent 3 weeks in a hospital recovering from his wounds. His mother, a dedicated communist, did disown him. They reconciled only after German reunification in 1990. The East German government conducted an extensive investigation but found no accomplices. The Stasi did plan a kidnapping operation in the 1980s, but abandoned it as too risky. Wolfgang became a teacher and firefighter in West Germany. He lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and German reunification. He spent his later years speaking about his experience and advocating for freedom and human rights. The BTR-152 used in the escape was recovered and is now displayed at the Allied Museum in Berlin. Its front end still scarred from the impact with the wall between 1961 and 1989. At least 140 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Wolfgang Engels was one of the lucky ones. He escaped, survived, and lived to see the barrier destroyed. His story remains one of the most dramatic and symbolically powerful of all Cold War escape attempts, representing the human desire for freedom and the courage required to seize it against overwhelming odds. A wall is just a wall. A barrier is just a barrier. They only have power if we accept them. On April 30th, 1963, one man decided not to accept his cage. He crashed through it at 63 kilometers per hour, and in doing so, prove that no prison, no matter how secure, no matter how permanent it seems, can hold the human spirit forever.